Bonjour, je suis Jacques Leclerc. Monsieur Canu, oh, vous parlez anglais. Un moment. Hi, I'm Jacques Leclerc. You see me in such fine quality AP Environmental Science educational videos such as Free Range, baby, on the rangeland, and There is more to conservation than Jacques Cousteau in the ocean. Huh. All right. So for us here, we're looking at Apes chapter 10 as we are trying to wrap this up. But since this is a Christmas video, I'm going to have you guys take a quick look at our little experiment here. That's right. Here we go. Here's our experiment. Okay, as we are going through, and you guys are seeing, and with that, we're now shifting back to our lecture at hand. Okay, guys, I'm doing the lecture because we need to keep going. We need to keep up the pace. Okay, and we've been talking about conservation, taking a look at the ecosystem approach in terms of biodiversity and species diversity, and looking at preservation of species, managing. And we talked a little bit about rangelands. We looked at unfenced grasslands versus pastures that are managed grasslands. And this just gives you a picture of what each would look like. They're very similar, but pastures are managed. The problem that we run into is that they're overgrazed, some of them. And it leads into things like cutting down on soil formation, erosion control, nutrient cycling, okay, maintenance of diversity, storage of atmospheric carbon dioxide and biomass. We've already covered that. And we also talked about the overgrazing. What are some of the problems? Again, erosion, the soil becomes compacted. You may remember the soil is all packed up, and it makes it very hard for seeds to go in. And then here we looked at lightly grazed rangeland here compared to overgrazed here. And this is where you can see more damage here because you're seeing less vegetation cover. And when you're seeing more sand like this, guess what? This is where you end up getting wind and soil erosion together. And that's just the way that's happening. We talked about the idea about managing the rangeland sustainably. We looked at rotational grazing, one area for a short time and then move on. We know that cows like the riparian areas. Those are the areas right next to rivers, streams, creeks, brooks that have a lot of vegetation to them. While the cows like that, the problem with the cows is, one, they do a lot of grazing, and two, they do a lot of foot stomping on there. Okay? So we have to be careful about that. We talked about suppressing the growth of invasive species, using things like herbicides, mechanical removal, controlled burning, controlled short-term trampling. Trampling has to do where you have a lot of animals that are in an area and you're letting them walk around. As they are walking around, they trample, they stamp, they pound plants into the ground. Like if this is a plant, they're pounding it into the ground. That's what we mean by trampling. Okay, we talked about replanting barren areas. You apply fertilizer, which also reduces soil erosion. We looked here at the San Pedro River Restoration Project in Arizona. Here's an example of before. Here's an example of after. Okay. We also looked at grazing and urban development in the American West. The Southwest population has been increasing since the 1980s. We talked about land trust groups, conservation easements. In other words, if you have an owner of a land, that they would give some of their land or make promises that they would not do anything with their land. They would keep it as natural as possible. Okay, they can't control things like fires or bad storms or flooding, things like that. That does happen in the Southwest. Okay, not hurricanes, not tornadoes, but things like flooding, flash flood flooding, storms, things like that. Of course, the idea is reducing the harmful impact, environmental impact of herds rotating cattle away from the riparian areas. We do have those here in Southern California as well. We try to protect them, those riparian areas, because of the biodiversity that they offer. Now, in this way, we also look at using less fertilizers and pesticides, and the idea is that we would operate the ranch more economically and sustainably. So these are some of the solutions that we are proposing. And what you need to understand is, when we talk about a solution, it's not just one thing that's going to solve the problem. It is a multiple approach to this. All right, let's keep going. So 10.4, sustaining biodiversity is going to need more effective protection of the existing parks and nature reserves, as well as protection of much more of the Earth's remaining undisturbed land area. Now that makes sense, okay? We do have a lot of national parks. We have many in the United States. Some of those parks are for historical purposes, like Jefferson's home, Washington's home in Mount Vernon, for example, the Gettysburg National Battlefield. Those are examples of places that it's not necessarily environmental, but it is, we still protect them. On the other side of the coin, we also have Yellowstone National Park, Yosemite National Park, where we are protecting. Now, there are parks in developing countries. Now, they do have the greatest biodiversity, okay? Only 1% are actually protected against illegal animal poaching and illegal logging and mining. There's still an economic consideration when you look, because how else, when you're looking at animal poaching, logging and mining, it's a question about money, which ultimately means for some people to feed their families. So before we go and condemn them and say, well, they're all criminals and they're only doing it for the greed of the money, not necessarily. There are those that they are trying to feed their families. You know, how do you solve a problem like this? Well, I can tell you in places like in Africa, where they have the nature reserves, they'll arm the game wardens with AK-47s, okay, because they need that kind of firepower when they're out there in the bush, okay, and they're dealing with poachers, because the poachers are well armed. Do not make that mistake. Now, we got 58 national parks in the U.S. Now, the thing is about our national parks, the biggest problem is popularity. Really, we love our parks to death. That's what I remember my geography professor telling us that. Noise, congestion, pollution, damage or destruction of vegetation and wildlife. You know, even taking a hike in the forest or going backpacking, like in the Sierras, you have to go to the ranger station and get a permit, because what they're doing, they're trying to keep a track of how many people are going into the area to visit and staying. It's not necessarily a day visit, but like if, let's say, you're spending the night or a couple of nights or a week, whatever it is, okay, that's pretty much an important idea there. So they're trying to keep track of how many people are using the parks, okay? Now, part of it also that there is stresses on the U.S. public parks, because we're looking at damage from non-native species like boars and mountain goats. Now, we can talk about a specific example of the European wild boar in North Carolina, okay? They were introduced and wow, they were very incredibly successful, okay? And that caused the problem, because that's causing damage. Introduced plants, insects, worms. And with the native species, the impact, sometimes they are killed or they're removed out of there. Okay, so that's a problem. Another problem is we have threatened islands of biodiversity from air pollution. Certainly air pollution would be another issue. We have no place on the planet where we are free of air pollution. We have places on the planet where we have less air pollution, okay, and we have places where it's heavily polluted, but there isn't any single place on the planet. I'm checking my timing here. Okay, right. So with that, okay, when we're talking about fixing trails, fixing things on the inside, like, you know, outhouses for people to go to the bathroom, making pathways, things like that, it takes money. It always takes money to fix those things. So here's the Grand Teton National Park, and again, you can see here, you know, it's just a beautiful place. Just absolutely gorgeous, way up north there. Now, of course, when we talk about off-road vehicles, do they do damage? Well, okay, I'm going to let you look at the picture and let you conclude that for yourself. Okay? So when you look at that, yeah. So there are designated places, just like out here in the California desert, there are designated places where people are allowed to take their off-road vehicles, whether it is motorcycles or three-wheel ATVs or four-wheel ATVs. ATV means all-terrain vehicle. Sometimes, you know, Jeeps, trucks, things like that, that they'll go in. And the people are just enjoying driving around in their vehicles. Okay, solutions. There's more than one way to try to provide solutions. Okay, buying private land inside parks. Yep. Add new parkland near threatened parks. Okay, but that's going to take money because you're probably going to be buying private land. Okay, seek private donations for park maintenance and repairs. Limit the number of visitors in crowded park areas. So these are some things. We have increased the number of park rangers and their pay. Well, yeah, they're not paid that much, and you don't have that many there. Encourage volunteers to give visitor lectures and tours. Okay, so in 1995, we're looking at the Yellowstone National Park, reintroducing the gray wolf. So it was reintroduced into the park. I don't know how many there were that were reintroduced, but by 2009 you had 116 wolves. By 2012 it was 97 wolves. So the population's gone down. I don't know what the latest counts are for that. Essentially what happened is that these wolves, they will go and prey on the elk, which is kind of a type of deer, for those of you who don't know, and push them to a higher elevation. So what's happening with the elk territory, where it was more spread out, because of predation thanks to the wolves, now the elks are retreating to higher elevations where it's harder for the wolf to go hunt them. Now in the process, because of that, trees like aspen and cottonwood and willow, since the elks are going bye-bye, they get to regrow. Okay, and as a result, we get more beaver dams. Beavers building the dams. The beaver is it looks sort of like a big rat, but the tail is very, very flat. Okay, and they've built dams with that. Because of more beaver dams, we end up getting more wetlands, we get more aspen. So there's a lot of things here. Now, the thing is, well, what happened? Why did we start? How did we get to the point where we had to go reintroduce wolves into the park? Well, in the past, okay, there have been issues with wolves attacking cattle, smaller mammals. Coyotes are doing the same thing. Because they cut down on the number, you get fewer attacks on the cattle, and you have more smaller mammals that are able to survive and reproduce. Because remember, the objective for all living things, two objectives. Number one, survive. You wake up the next day, or you wake up at night if you happen to be a nocturnal creature. Okay? The second is reproduce, because you want your genes to be carried on down into posterity. Posterity, I should say, not posterity, it's posterity, not to be confused with prosperity. Okay? So, again, the nature reserves occupy only a small part of the Earth's land. Currently, less than 13% of them are actually protected. The conservationist goal would be to protect 20%, which would be nice. Okay, cooperation between government, private groups, and concerned individuals. So you have groups like the Nature Conservancy, for example, that they will go and buy land to go and preserve it. Now, there are also land trust groups. Now, I can go off on a rant here on this moment here about the Nature Conservancy because over where my dad has his house, it used to overlook the Big Tioga Canyon Wash, which was inside of LA city limits. And what was happening was, it was the last giant patch of undeveloped land. So it was wild. You had coyotes, you had deer, okay, you had bobcats, you know, you had the spiny stickleback, which is an endangered species, by the by. And what happened was that there were people who wanted to, the owners, they wanted to do something with the land, they wanted to develop it. So there were those of us, and this is when I was younger, we went to organizations like the Nature Conservancy, say, hey, we got this land here, can you go buy it for the love of humanity and preserve it? And the Nature Conservancy, or the Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy said, no. And that's where I get off on my rant and say, hypocrites. At the end, the result of what happened with that land is going to be on your second semester final exam. Ah! Yeah. Okay. So Silver Creek Nature Conservancy preserved near Sun Valley, Idaho. Very pretty indeed. Designing and connecting nature reserves. Large versus small reserves. Okay. We have what's called the buffer zone concept. Really, when they talk about a buffer, okay, you think about it in chemistry, where if you have a solution and you are trying to add acid to it to drive down the pH, but it's taking a lot more acid than you normally would be able to do. That's a buffer. In other words, it's absorbing a bunch of the acid. Now that's in the chemistry sense. But if we're looking at a buffer zone, okay, if you have your original patch of land, okay, a buffer zone would be an area around it that we try to keep people away from it and ultimately protect what's in here. That's the idea behind the buffer zone. That's the buffer zone. Okay? So for the United Nations, we have 553 biosphere reserves in 107 countries. Now, habitat corridors are between these isolated reserves. Advantages and disadvantages. Well, it's like everything else. So if you got these two areas here, and let's say you have buffer zones, but they're not connected, it's not going to do you a lot of good if those species need to get from point A to point B. And that's why you have to create this habitat corridor. And that's what this is. This is the habitat corridor. This is what allows to make connections between our preserved area A and our preserved area B. And the blue circle, those are the buffer zones. So this is a way that we can design and plan and manage some of these nature reserves and try to preserve what we have and not do any more harm. That's the idea. Okay? So there are some advantages to it, and I just described it. But what about disadvantages? Well, that means you got to do more land. You have to reserve. You have to put in more land. You have to go and when you go design it, now you have to take considerations of, well, what about for economic development? So that's more of a pain to go and work with it, but that's pretty important. Okay? Wilderness. Now, wilderness, the definition is land officially designated as having no serious disturbance from human activities. The Wilderness Act of 1964. It does have its controversies as well. Okay? Now, the Wilderness Act of 1964, it protects undeveloped lands. 2% of the lower 48 states are protected. That's what we mean by 48. When we say lower 48, that's the main part of the United States. The 48 states, not counting Hawaii and Alaska, because that's not part of the mainland of the United States. Okay? Now, there has been an increase from 1970 to 2010 that we have a 10-fold increase. So we are actually trying to protect more land out there. Now, in 2009, we've got 2 million more acres getting wilderness protection, which some of it is including up here in the local desert as well. There is a 50% increase in the length of wild and scenic rivers that are also being protected. Okay?